Namaskar and welcome to one more episode of What Does This Data Say? I don't know how many of you thought so that this time around the speech of our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, on 15th August from the Red Fort was very uncharacteristic of him. It could not be called a Modi speech. Although the Prime Minister was looking very dull, drab, and tired, as if his mind is occupied somewhere else. The only thing new I could notice is that there was a new headgear as he has every year. It is quite apparent, and many analysts have pointed out that the Prime Minister is already preoccupied with trying to ascertain that he wins the 2024 general election. Now, having gone into that mode, the entire government machinery also follows suit. If you would notice, the normal activities of governance are totally missing. There are no conferences, there are no press announcements, there are no inaugurations, there are no meetings, no project launches, nothing you would be hearing these days. And since there was nothing much to report on the economic or the governance front, Mr. Modi had to cook up something for Independence Day. And sorry to say, this time around, it was a very non Modi speech. The Bharatiya Janata Party and its supporters have a very bad habit of looking down upon each and every previous or earlier prime minister. They always forget the baton is always handed over from one government to the other, and it's not as if Mr. Modi had to climb the entire mountain all over again. In this 15 to 20-minute episode, we can't do a great in depth analysis of everything that matters. However, I have chosen five parameters that, according to me, are enough to act as indicators of the overall performance of a prime minister. The five parameters are related to the GDP, the population, migration, unemployment, and inflation. Now we will fill up this table. The best performing prime minister will be marked in green and given 5 stars, and the next best performer will be marked in yellow and given 3 stars. I know there are many other important parameters like education, health, drinking water, infrastructure. We'll leave it for some other episode. Also, we will sum up the number of stars for each prime minister and try to find the best performer. Obviously, there is never going to be a worst performer because, as I believe, every prime minister has done some good for the country sometime. So let's start by looking at the graph of the Indian GDP. This data I have taken from the World Bank from 1960 till 2021. Just look at the shape of the curve and the arrows which I have shown. Our GDP in 1960 stood at $37 billion, and 60 years down the line, it has almost become 100 times that. It's just over $3 trillion. The turning point came in 1992, before which it was growing at a very, very slow pace. In fact, 91, it was almost going down. And then came the period of Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh, and you look at the red arrow, that how fast our economy has grown since then to reach the $3 trillion figure. Mr. Modi took over in 2014 when the economy was $2 trillion and has managed to increase it by $1 trillion in the last 8 years. Much of what we stand today is due to Manmohan Singh and P.V. Narasimha Rao. Today, many of us Indians, and especially our politicians, are quick to pat ourselves on the back and say that India today is the sixth largest or the fifth largest economy in the world. By the end of last year, we were at number 6 position, just behind United Kingdom, and it's quite possible we would have overtaken United Kingdom this year. But before you join the party along with our politicians, I'll tell you two things which you should think about. The first is that at the time of independence, India was then too the sixth largest economy. Now, that something should sink in, which only means that in the last 60 years, India has grown. If India has grown, so has the world grown. Now, this will not suddenly bring you the same cheer as what the politicians would like you to believe. Secondly, have a look at this column, GDP per capita. India's GDP is only little over $2,000, while the others in this list, the top 10 or 12, are all above $30,000, $50,000, $60,000. We still remain a relatively poor country. Now, if I sort the same table on the per capita GDP, the story is completely different. In terms of per capita GDP, India is at the 150th position. It is one step below Bangladesh and about 12 notches above Pakistan. The highest per capita GDP is that of Ireland with over $100,000, and US stands at the fifth position at 69,375 US dollars. And this is one reason I always advise people to look at the per capita figures rather than the aggregate figures. One aspect of the GDP to be looked at is the GDP doubling rate. Now, that gives you an idea of the state of political affairs within the country and the governance provided by the Prime Minister of the day. Now, this is the GDP doubling chart. I start with 1960 at $37 billion. Why 1960? Because from 1960 onward, the data is available in the World Bank archives. Now, the first period of doubling was almost 12 years. That is from 1960 to 72, when the GDP reached $71.5 billion. This was the period mostly with Nehru, Shastri, and little bit of Indira Gandhi. Next time around, the GDP doubled much faster in 6 years. This is the period when Indira Gandhi was fully in control, the emergency period, and leading to her ouster in 1977. GDP became $137 billion by the end of 78. The next doubling period is of 9 years between 78 and 87. This was again a period of political instability. Indira Gandhi's second term, her assassination, Rajiv Gandhi taking over. Now, after this, it takes 16 years to double the GDP to come to 600 billion, 87 to 2003. This has been the worst period in the history of India as far as economics goes. Political instability all through, and whatever could go wrong went wrong during this period. Lastly, when Manmohan Singh comes, it took only 5 years again to double the GDP to bring it close to $1.2 trillion dollars, and thereafter in 8 years to 2.2 trillion dollars, and then the baton was handed over to Modi. Now, this is where you will see that how Modi has been struggling with the economy. If I take an average growth rate to be of 8% for the next 5 years, our economy may reach $5 trillion by 2027. And by that time, it will be 11 years. Again, one of the highest periods for a GDP to be doubling. Today, our GDP stands around $3 trillion. So let's see who was the best performer in handling the GDP. This chart shows the average GDP growth rates during the tenure of each of these prime ministers. The best rate, of course, is Morarji Desai, but I have neglected him because his tenure was too short. Thereafter comes Manmohan Singh at the top position with 11.8% growth rate, and followed by Nehru with 11.8%. 1% for the period for which I have analyzed the data. These days, not only is Modi acting very similar to how Indira Gandhi was acting just before the emergency, his economic performance also seems to be equal to that of Indira Gandhi, who had given a growth rate of about 6.8 to 6.9, Modi on the same lines, 6.9%. Let me now talk about the second parameter, which is related to the growth of the population. According to an RBI document, our population today stands at 139 crores. In this, 38.8% of Indians are below the age of 18, that is about 54 crores, the remaining 85 being the voters in this country. India remains a young country. The people in the age group of 19 to 35, also known as the millennial, stand at around 40 crores. The senior citizens above 60 at 10 crores. Population growth rates don't seem to be an issue anymore. What is going to become an issue very soon is when all these millennials start becoming senior citizens. How the country is going to handle 30% of its people as senior citizens. This is the population growth rate curve starting from 1960 onwards. There was a period when the population kept growing up till 1981, and that's when Indira Gandhi decided to give family planning a push, and the famous slogan, Hum Do, Hamare Do, was announced. This 2% growth rate was notoriously known as the Hindu rate of growth. Successive governments kept up the thrust to limit the growth rate, and the fruits of which we see today when the growth rate has fallen below 1%. So, which prime minister brought out the biggest change in the population growth rates? Let's have a look. This graph shows the change in the growth rate. This is not the growth rate, it's the change in the growth rate. The biggest change was brought about in the growth rate, in the population growth rate during Manmohan Singh's time. And before that, it was during Nehru's time. So, yet again, for bringing down the growth rate, it was Manmohan Singh and Jawaharlal Nehru. The third parameter which I'm going to talk about is net migration. Now, I'm bringing up this parameter only because this issue keeps getting raised again and again. And depending on which side of the table you are sitting, you will either say that, oh, many Indians are running away from India during Modi's period, whereas on the other side, the people are going to vouch for it that no such thing is happening. People have been leaving the country since ages. The data shown here is migration rate per thousand. So if you multiply by thousand, you will get the rate per million. So this value here at 0.40 per thousand implies 40 per million. Now, because of India's position and the global economy, the net migration rate of India has been negative right from 1991 onward. It has sort of stabilized in the last 10 years and is now around roughly 400 per million. There is very little to choose between Manmohan Singh's tenure and Modi's tenure, and the values being similar. So, this further cements the fact that net migration has very little to do with the political condition of India in the current days. The fourth parameter, the unemployment rate. Let's have a look. The unemployment data is available from 1991 onward. Therefore, the period of Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi has been excluded from my analysis. However, governments after 1991 were successful in maintaining the unemployment rate between 5 and 6%. That is until the corona struck in 2022 when it suddenly jumped to 8%. The unemployment rate, for those of you who are unaware, is the number of unemployed people when it is compared to the total workforce of the country. So, due to the pandemic, it was very obvious that since millions lost their jobs, the unemployment rate was to go up. However, the very next year in 2021, the unemployment rate suddenly dropped to 6%. So that coincided with the V-shaped recovery of our economy till last year. Now everyone would forgive Modi for the unemployment because Corona period was something that was not under his control. However, the things did not stop there for Modi. Have a look at this figure. The very next year, that is today in 2022 July, the unemployment rate is back to 7.8%. So unemployment was almost back to what it was during the Corona year. And this is what the opposition has been saying, that we are undergoing a phase of jobless growth. If I plot the average unemployment growth during the tenure of the prime ministers, again, Narendra Modi figures as the worst performer. The best performance comes from Manmohan Singh, followed by that by PV Narasimha Rao. And the last parameter, inflation. Here is the inflation curve of India from 1960 to 2021. If you observe during Indira Gandhi's time, at one point of time, the inflation went up to 28.6%. Today, we get worried if it crosses 5%. However, Narendra Modi has been handling inflation rather well. From 2014 onwards, the inflation was below 5% till the period Corona struck. So let's look at the results. Who is the best and the second best prime minister to handle the issues on these five parameters? So the first one on GDP, Manmohan Singh tops with 5 stars, Nehru second. On population growth, again Manmohan Singh tops, Nehru second. On migration rate, Nehru tops, Narasimha Rao second. Unemployment, Manmohan Singh tops, second Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and on inflation, Nehru tops, and second place Narendra Modi. If we add up all these stars, Nehru is at top at 16, followed by Manmohan Singh at 15, and remaining are all in the range of 3 stars. So, two prime ministers almost 50 years apart are the ones which have done the maximum for our country. Now, before you jump and say, oh, but Modi had to face Corona, I will not buy that argument. My stand on this is very clear. Every prime minister of this country had to face his share of calamities, his share or her share of headwinds. We only talk of Corona because it is so recent in our memories. So I'm going to leave you with a very small list of headwinds that were faced by all the prime ministers. I'm not going to read out. I'll just leave it for you and just you so that you can ponder over it and decide for yourself. Thank you for watching this episode. I'll see you again next week with some more interesting data. Till then, namaskar and goodbye.